So, first of all, I want us to explore the political implications of these petitions. Given the historical precedent of Charlotte Osei's removal in 2018, do you think that these petitions suggest a pattern? And if so, what are the implications?
Thank you very much. So, on the face of it, um, I mean, this looks like, this is a constitutional process where a couple of citizens who feel that the electoral commission, both the chair as well as a number of deputies, need to be held accountable, and the constitution prescribes some steps that one has to go through for that accountability to be executed, with the ultimate sanction being removal from office. It, however, doesn't help that we already have a precedent from the removal of Madam Charlotte Osei. And what I've always maintained is that even if there were some legitimate concerns and grounds for that process, for triggering that process that led to her removal prior to the 2016 election, there were a number of comments and narratives in the public space that pointed to the fact that some did say, look, if we win this election, we will change the EC, we will appoint a new EC. So even if there was legitimacy to that process, it had been prejudiced by our politics. Now, fast forward, here we are a number of years later. And again, in the lead up to the 2024 election, if you follow different conversations in different public spaces, those who were aggrieved, particularly the partisans who were aggrieved by some of the actions and decisions of the EC, did not restrain themselves from saying, this EC has to go, and if we win the election, this EC has to go. In fact, after the election, we've seen some very prominent voices on the side of the ruling government who have called for the resignation of the EC chair. So I say all of this to say that, in an environment where partisanship is deepening, where political polarization is deepening, what you run into is this emerging pattern of, once a precedent has been set, in my opinion, it looks as though the partisan interpretation of that is, it is a it is a precedent that must be repeated. It is a precedent that must go on. But having said all of that, again, I am not opposed to any accountability processes that holds public officials accountable for their time in office. But I think the patterns we are seeing, some of the rhetoric in public spaces, if you look at the conversations, particularly among partisans, then for me, it is worrying that we are setting a precedent where partisans would start feeling like whenever there is a turnover election, that some way, somehow, certain critical, sensitive positions uh, which are part of the safeguards of our democracy architecture, has to also undergo some change.
Prof, let me quickly add on. You spoke on accountability. So, on this premise, how do we then distinguish between legitimate accountability and politically motivated interferences?
So for me, one of the things that we also need to do is to go back and clarify um, Article 146, whether it is through a constitutional amendment or whether it is through regulatory reform that gives a little more specificity. And I use the US as an example. So I recall during an impeachment process in the US, the president had been charged with other high crimes and misdemeanors. And the question was asked, well, what are other high crimes and misdemeanors? To which a lawyer said, it is whatever a majority of the House of Representatives decide it is. So if you look at 146, where it says stated misbehavior and incompetence, there are some things that I think reasonable minds can agree on constitute stated misbehavior. So, for example, if you learn that the chair of your EC took a bribe from a political party to help them win an election, and there is evidence of that, I don't think anybody would debate that it's an egregious act of stated misbehavior, and therefore you must trigger some accountability and remove the person from office. But sometimes it's also not clear what we even mean by stated misbehavior and incompetence. And so some guidelines for me will be needed to ensure that whenever we trigger 146, there is no sort of this emerging narrative that it's all about politics. I mean, we can never discount the politics of the process, but at least when you are fully aware of the specifics and the grounds upon which you're triggering 146, it helps you at least separate the legitimacy from the politics. The other thing I would quickly add is, uh, and I don't know how possible this is, but it would also help if the partisans who support or oppose these accountability mechanisms can be a little more restrained in their public rhetoric. So, as I mentioned before, there are some prominent voices who did say, we will change this EC, the EC has to resign. So, even when there is a legitimate basis for that, you've already prejudiced it a year ahead of the process or 2 years ahead of it. So it becomes difficult not to sometimes sort of read political motives into some of these things. But I think some clarification of 146 in terms of what stated misbehavior constitutes, what incompetence constitutes, and being a little restrained in the public commentary, at least for those who are involved in the process or have a stake in the process, I think would help insulate it a little bit more from the politics.
Thank you, Prof. Is it to say you think that there are some ambiguities in Article 146?
Yes, there definitely are, because, as I said, stated misbehavior and incompetence, right? Reasonable minds can disagree on some of the things that one would consider to be quote unquote incompetence, or one would consider to be stated misbehavior, even on the question of incompetence. So let's just say that a registration exercise is going on, and on the day of voter registration, there are equipment failures, for example, or materials arrived late. Are we going to look at something like that and say that it does fit under incompetence, and therefore you want to trigger 146? Or are there some things that are just administrative challenges for which there are other appropriate sanctions before you trigger 146? Because for me, that article is designed to to sort of punish very egregious types of behavior. And so you want to sometimes look at, are there other appropriate sanctions for some of these stated misbehaviors and incompetence before we even think about triggering 146? Now, if 146 is the appropriate punishment, I'm not opposed to that, but I'm just saying we ought to tread carefully whenever we want to trigger 146.
Thank you so much, Prof.